Okay. Greetings. Oops. Greetings from Tokyo. Sorry about this. This is Daisuke, and I hope you're well. So I'm just setting up here. So just give me a moment, and we can get started. So great. Once again, just setting up. Now, okay. All right. Sorry about this. I'm just setting up as always. So, okay, the live chat is up and running, I see. So Wolfgratz is here. Hello. Jared is here. Hello. Marlon is here. And if the sound is the sound okay? If the sound's okay, then we can just wait maybe a minute or so, and then we can get started. Ole's here. Hello. Great. Great. Wonderful. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. We'll just give it another minute. I know we're starting a little bit late, so it's now 6 o'clock by my clock here, but we'll just start a little bit, maybe at 6:01 if you don't mind. So I today's theme is Taxi Driver, the 1976 film directed by Martin Scorsese and with screenplay by Paul Schrader and starring, among other people, the actor named Robert De Niro. And this has, I think, a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, it has a lot of power and potency as a film, even today. And I think that it is a film that is quite strong in terms of how well it's aged. And I'll try to get into some reasons as to why I think that might be inherent, maybe in the style of the film, the way that the scenes are constructed, how certain cinematic tricks are employed in order to convey a sense of, for instance, the atmosphere of the city, New York, or the inner internalities or the psychological situation or condition of our main character, Travis Bickle, among other things. But yes, so there are certain stylistic points about this film that I think really make this timeless and quite interesting in terms of how to interpret the film. I think this leads also to a similar but distinct point also, which is that I think the way in which it's constructed also lends the film nicely to different points of interpretation, different ways of interpreting the film. I think those of you who've already seen the film, you'll agree that there is some ambiguity to some parts of the film, and such that I think we can look at the film and maybe come away from it with different interpretations as to, for instance, what happened to the Travis Bickle character. What is this all going on in terms of actually going on, or is there something else more deep-rooted going on in terms of what's going on inside the mind of Travis Bickle, and those sorts of broad conversations. So, among other things. And so I do, hopefully, if we have time, I'll try to touch on my thoughts about all those things and some other points along the way. So this is, for those of you who are new, this is a sort of regular thing that we do, which is we pick a film and we talk about it over the live stream. And there is the live chat available for any of you who want to chime in, who want to share your thoughts with me or with other people here in the group, and just talk about this film, Taxi Driver, and what we think of it. I will do my best to address all of the comments in the live chat to the best of my ability. And so with that in mind, my friends, as always, I must ask, as sort of preliminary thing before we go into the film in earnest, is I will be addressing comments that are talking about Taxi Driver. And so if you have comments in the chat that pertain to other films or other topics, then please forgive me, but in the interest of time, I would like just to skip over those comments because today I want to focus my energies on the film Taxi Driver. So if you want to talk about another film, you can leave a comment on another video elsewhere. I'm sure that many conversations are possible. But for now, my friends, let's focus our attention on Taxi Driver. And with that also, we will be talking about specific details of the film Taxi Driver. And that means that if you have not seen the film Taxi Driver, then it's probably a good idea to not watch this particular live stream. It will be uploaded as a video to YouTube as soon as it's over. So you can always watch this as a video after the fact. So after you've seen the film, then you can always come back. And if you're still interested, my friends, you can watch this video later. So, but please understand that we will be talking about specific details of this film. So it is a film that still has the potential to shock and surprise and really unnerve one. And so I think the power of the film is in part due to the initial shock value of the film upon first viewing. Therefore, I don't want to somehow diminish the impact of that by mentioning these details to someone who hasn't seen the film. And so if you are one of those people, my friends, again, don't worry. You can always come back to this video later after the fact. But once again, I strongly suggest that you turn off this video if you haven't seen the film. Lastly, I would like to say that I am coming at this film, Taxi Driver, not in any way as a sort of expert or a scholar in the film. I don't claim to be a scholar or an expert, and so I'm here as a kind of fan and admirer of this work. And I will try my best to articulate what it is I think about this film from my viewpoint as a fan and admirer. But I don't come with it with any sort of deep-rooted scholarship, and so I don't claim to be an expert in the film, but my intention with this live stream is to just talk with other film enthusiasts or film fans out there about certain ideas that might come up as we watch this film Taxi Driver. So as fellow fans of this film, or as fellow admirers of this film, or perhaps some of you are critics of this work in terms of seeing certain negative aspects of this film, and that's okay too. Of course, that's perfectly fine. The world of cinema and cinema discussion is a big enough tent, and should be a big enough tent, to talk reasonably and amicably and openly about things that we like and things that we don't like about a certain work of art. I mean, that's how art should work. And so if you have a negative feeling about this film as well, please feel free to share it with us, and we will, everyone hopefully will treat each other with respect in terms of one's own opinions and everyone else's own opinions, as has always been in the past. So that's one of the things I really like about this YouTube thing, is that it's enabled me to be able to meet a lot of great people who have always had great respect for everyone else's opinions, and so that spirit of openness will hopefully continue today. So, with that, my friends, let me just start with a kind of opening, if you will, in terms of this film, which is, I think, if regardless of where you are on the spectrum of liking it or not liking the film, and I grant you, this film, I think, has a lot going for it, but also has a lot there that has the potential of turning off a number of people in terms of the film's subject matter and the way it presents its subject matter, the level of violence, the degree to which sexuality is portrayed, and I think most impactfully, the psychological description and depiction of this character, Travis Bickle, who may or may not be, all that he seems to be on screen as we see him. And I will hopefully get into the really deep and fascinating contradictions in the character of Travis Bickle later in this video. As Betsy says, right, he's a walking contradiction, right? So there are a number of things that I think are very intense about this film, and so they have the potential, I think, of turning off a number of people. So, but at the same time, there are a number of great things about this that are undeniably great, and so I think this film has the potential for maybe polarization. Maybe some people really are into it, some people might not necessarily be into it, I think. But wherever one lies, wherever one falls in that spectrum, if you will, I think we can all say that without a doubt, this is a film that is charged with a kind of high-level intensity that is quite disturbing in many respects. And the high-level intensity is a kind of well, let me step back here. So, talking about this high-level intensity film, then we can talk very briefly as a sort of opening statement as to what is this film, right? What kind of film is this? And I think the answer to that is that it's a film that is one that has many hats, if you will. So on the one hand, I think it can be seen as a sort of, to put it very simply, it can be seen as I said, a high-intensity drama about a man who is going down this sort of, one can call it a downward spiral, and his choices and actions as a result of, or in consequence of, this downward spiral that he finds himself in. Now, whether the downward spiral is self-imposed or involuntary, that's another thing I'll get to in a second. But I would say also that as a general proposition, this idea of the film as a drama, I think focuses or hinges on the idea of, if we think of drama as the sort of the stories or the narratives that come out between that as a result of the interactions between human beings, or the collisions between human beings, then I think we can think of this film as a drama in the sense that we have the clash or collision of what I like to call the externalities and the internalities. So the externalities being these external stimuli that exist in the world of, or the city of New York, the world, which Travis calls a hell. There's a real almost grime or dirty grittiness that's depicted in this so-called hell. And not only that, we have people occupying that space, whether it be total strangers that Travis just witnesses through the glass as he's driving his taxi, people walking alone, walking in couples, whether they be just people walking, going, just fighting, yelling, screaming, or they be people that are more in his sort of inner circle, so to speak. The other tappies there, Wizard and Doughboy Charlie T as an example, or the other people in his other orbits. Then we get into the things with Betsy, and then also with Iris as well, and then also on television and Palantine and all that stuff. This is all, I think, creating the sense of the externalities that create the stimuli, which almost bombard Travis as a character, as he's insulated either in his house, in his apartment, or in his taxi cab as well. And it's those externalities and the stimuli that I think give him certain ideas, or that maybe not give him ideas, but they, through some process of the processing of external information that occurs in the human mind, it leads to certain steps that Travis takes that eventually lead to the eventual conclusion of the film. And I'll get to specifics in that in a second. But also I mentioned the clash between externalities and internalities, because I think that's only one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is Travis Bickle himself as a character. And I think we can all agree that Travis Bickle is one of the, I think, and I mean this in a very positive, complimentary way, I think his character, the way it's set up, is, for me as a film viewer, when I look at his character, I think it's one of the most frustrating characters to try to read, because there is just so much stuff going on with this character inside, and it's very difficult for me to get a real sense of who he is. I mean, we get certain senses of what kind of person he might be, but then there are other moments in the film that tend towards something quite opposite, and there are, again, tensions even within himself. And I think that I don't want to call it turmoil, but I think that, again, let's use the word that Betsy uses, right? The walking contradiction, and that idea of contradictions inside him, I think is very inherent to his character, and I think that's done on purpose. Now, whether it's all real or whether it's a construct of his own imagination, that's something else that I would like to get into as well. But I think we can all agree that there are some moments where Travis seems to be very, very unable to try to interact with other people. He seems to be just very off. He's on a different key from the rest of the people. So his conversations with people don't necessarily stick, and people around him don't seem to be necessarily listening to what it is he's saying. So there doesn't seem to be any connection on the one hand, and he does show certain, let's say, lapses in judgment, and we'll get into those in a minute, but they seem on the surface to suggest a real deep naivete about the world. And I bring up the example, the great, spectacular example, perhaps, of his decision to take Betsy to the adult movie for their date, essentially, which turns out, of course, to be this utter disaster. And it leads to essentially Betsy's rejection of Travis, which I think one can argue would essentially is the catalyst, if you will, for a lot of the rest of the events of the film. So on the one hand, he seems to display a real deep naivete about the world, and almost a childlike misunderstanding of the world around him. But at the same time, he also displays certain instances of confidence, forthrighteousness, and also he is assertive in ways that don't seem necessarily, at least at first glance, to mesh with the other the naive or seemingly naive and inexperienced parts of his life. So, he seems very assertive when he is, for instance, approaching Betsy for the first time. He goes into the Palantine campaign offices there in New York, and he just asks her out for a cup of coffee. Or later when he is talking with Iris, and he's very strong-willed almost, and trying desperately to essentially save her. Of course, I think one's motives can lead one to act in certain ways that one might not necessarily act in ordinary circumstances. I grant you that, but I think there is a certain sense of contradiction already inherent within the internality space that Travis Bickle as a character occupies. And so I think I will try to talk about that later, but this idea, therefore, let's take a step back of the externalities and the internal and the external, how these clash and collide, how they mesh, or how they just don't at all link, right? This all, I think, can be said to be at the heart of the so-called drama of the film Taxi Driver. And then, as I say, I'll try to get to more details later in the second half of this. But, excuse me. Then I would say also, as what this film is, it can be seen as I guess we could call it a kind of horror film, in the sense that there is a way in which the film is presenting itself in terms of the way things are shot, and the music that is employed, the Bernard Herrmann score, which is also a very key component, and the almost the darkness that is portrayed here, and the violence that is also portrayed here. I would suggest that it could also be seen as a kind of horror film. Bernard Herrmann is a very famous, or he was a very famous film composer, and he, I think, the strongest link is with Taxi Driver and earlier films that Bernard Herrmann wrote the scores for, I think, is the film Psycho. I don't know if you know the film Psycho, but the score that's used here in Taxi Driver has almost direct quotes from the score that Bernard Herrmann supplied for the film Psycho. There's a sort of a 3-note motif that's used in Psycho that is employed in this film Taxi Driver, I think, twice. Once in the middle of the film, after Travis has gotten all of his guns, the 4 guns that he has gotten, and it occurs just as he's walking out of his taxi and he's going into that small grocery store, remember? And it's the scene where we see the store being held up by an African American at gunpoint, and then Travis just happens to be there, and he just turns around and he says, "Hey," and he just shoots the boy in the face. It was a real frightening moment, actually. But we hear, prior to him entering the grocery store, the 3-note motif, which is very similar to the motif used in Psycho. The same motif is used at the very end as a sort of mid-end credit sequence. It's just after Betsy has left a taxi and Travis is driving off, and we hear that little right, and then Travis is seen driving, and we see the lights through the windshield, and then we hear the saxophone music and the credits, right? And then as that sequence ends, before we go to the final end credits roll, there's a final shot of New York, the smoky, steamy, hellish depths of New York. And then we hear once again the 3-note motif continued on into sort of a grand and deep clash of musical darkness, if you will. Bernard Herrmann's score, which I think, right, it was his final score that he supplied before he passed away. And so the links to Psycho, I think, help one to recognize that this film can be a kind of horror film. I mean, in fact, the whole start of the film with the taxi, where we have the smoke, and then we have the taxi in slow motion just almost rising through the depths, through the smoke, almost like a huge monster or monolith, if you will. And then the title Taxi Driver comes on. I think it lends itself very nicely to seeing the actual idea of the taxi itself as a monster or something, or it's going through hell. Then I think if we think of it as a horror film, I think it's an interesting way of examining the film. But then that leads one to the idea of, okay, well, if this is a horror film, then what or who is the monster, so to speak? What is the monster? What is the horrifying threat? What is the thing that is the threat of the film, right? In the terms of horror films, what is the monster? And so I would say that under that, let's say, rubric or view of the film, I think we can say that there are many different monsters, potentially some anyway, of the film itself, which is the city itself the monster? Is Travis himself the monster? Is it sport and the other pimps and the mafioso that's involved there? The people who are exploiting Iris, are these the monsters? Or is it something else that's the monster? And I think this interpretation or the view of this film as a horror film, I think, is really nice because it can lead one to different conclusions about what actually is the threat, right? And I think we can have the same. We can hold the view, for instance, that, let's say, Travis is the monster, because there are some moments in this film where he is depicted as a real frightening force. I think culminating perhaps in the shot where we finally see him and his shaved head, the mohawk haircut, and we realize that he has really just succumbed to whatever it is that he plans to do at that moment. And at that moment, we understand that he is thinking perhaps about trying to attack the presidential candidate, Senator Palantine. And so, but that's a moment where I think he is truly depicted as almost monstrous. But that is interesting too, because he's not the monster throughout the entirety of the film, right? And even at the end of the film, when things return to normalcy, and Travis, we understand, is a kind of hero, but we will talk about whether this is a real thing or an imagined fantasy of his. We'll talk about that later, but for purposes of the narrative itself, we understand that at the end of the film, things have returned to normal, and Travis now was heralded as a kind of hero who saved the day. Right? So we understand, in other words, I think the way in which Travis is depicted helps us to sympathize with him immensely, but also we are almost repulsed by him at moments. And so that, I think, if we understand him to be this quote-unquote monster of this horror film, then I think the film presents the monster concept in a very complicated way. Even with the idea of sport, the Harvey Keitel character, Matthew, or Sport. He is a vile character in many ways, not least of which, of course, because of his role in sexually exploiting the Iris character. Very, very terrible, vicious character. There is a moment where I think there's a moment of almost trying to humanize his character when we see a moment of intimacy between him and Jodie Foster's Iris character. And she says, I don't like what I'm doing, Sport, and you never spend any time with me. And he's trying to comfort her and console her, almost love her in a way, which is and he puts on the record, and the music, the Bernard Herrmann music, enters the world of the film in a very interesting way. But I wouldn't necessarily call that scene one that sympathizes or helps us to sympathize with the character Sport. I think, if anything, that scene makes him more disgusting and repellent in an interesting way. But I think the moment where I think we come closest to sympathizing perhaps with the Sport character is at the end, at the shootout, where he is, of course, shot in a very horrible way. He is, right up to then, he was a kind of monster, if you will, but suddenly he becomes a victim to another monster, potentially so. That is Travis Bickle. And so I think that's an interesting switch in a really great way that cinema can do. right? This idea of playing both sides, or playing with our need to try to ally ourselves with certain characters over others. The moment where Travis pulls out the gun and he says, "Suck on this," and then he shoots Sport, and Sport's just like of course, he's repelled backwards, his body crumbles to the ground almost. But the way that's depicted, it's all in one shot, and it's so heartbreaking almost, because it's like, Sport he's just not even doing anything in a typical Hollywood cinematic way, right? It's just shot as it is, and he's just saying, "Ow, ow," he's just saying, "Ow, ow, ow, ow," that sort of thing. I think it's a very, I want to say, human moment, but it's a moment where I feel so bad for him, actually, because that's such a horrible thing that's going on. Even though I find his character up to that point to be so vile, so disgusting, that's a moment where I feel a little bit for his situation. So my point with that is that I think it's not easy to apply the moniker of monster to just one character or another without feeling a sense of ambiguity or vagueness with respect to that position, which I think is a remarkable thing about this film Taxi Driver and what it has to offer. There is one other way that I think we can view this film, many ways. I think one other important way that we can view this film as a kind of meditation on loneliness. And I think that's probably the strongest way, or one of the most potent ways in which we, the viewers, or at least I, as a viewer, can see this film. I think it's a very powerful meditation on loneliness, but I think it's actually a little bit more complicated than how I'm describing it to be. I don't think it is about loneliness, but there is something to that loneliness which I think is quite complicated, and it's something I don't quite have the answers to. But before I get carried away, let me now just return to the live chat and just see what it is. See what it is you have to say about this film, and then we can go from there. So let's see here. So Jared says, you listened to the commentary of the film last night on Blu-ray. Great, that's a great commentary. Yes. That also has the excuse me. That also has the documentary as well. That's really great. Let's see. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, Tim is here. Hello. Let's see. Jared says, "I love this film. One of the best films in the 1970s." Yes, it is. It is really great. There was a moment in my young adult life. There was a time in my young adult life. I think I was in maybe I was a freshman or sophomore in college, perhaps, maybe a little bit earlier, I forget. But I actually watched this film quite often, and I was just marveling at what it had to offer and the kinds of things that it was showing us. It was really, really something else. And I still hold such fondness and admiration and respect for this film. I think it was one of those. I think it was one of those great discoveries for me when I was growing up. Really impactful. Andre, hello. It's nice to see you, my friend. Tim says Taxi Driver is still my fave Scorsese film. Yes, I think that's true. I haven't thought about that yet, and I don't want to get into too much of a discussion on other Scorsese works here, but for me, it probably, it could be up there as well. I haven't, oh gosh, that's so hard to say right now, but let's see. Jared says, this is my favorite film of not just Scorsese, but my favorite De Niro film. Fantastic film. Yes, the De Niro performance is magnificent. It's absolutely magnificent. And I do want to get into little aspects of his performance in the context of the Travis Bickle character discussion, maybe in the second half of this discussion. So, Jordan Timmerman, hello, it's nice to see you. Thank you for making such thoughtful and informative videos. Well, no, not at all. My videos, I don't think are. I mean, thank you for the very kind compliment. I wish they were more thoughtful than they are. They're not really. They're just me just talking. But your compliment is really quite kind. So thank you very much, Jordan, and I hope you're well. Thank you. Mike is here. Hello. You're in Las Vegas. So hello. Yes, and Jared says Travis Bickle also has PTSD due to his involvement in the Vietnam War. He was in the Marine Corps. Yes, this is another aspect of the Travis Bickle character that I do want to get into. The fact that we get very little of his background, but what we do get seems to be very important. This idea of him being in the Marines came up at the very outset of the film, as you so rightly point out, Jared, when Travis is essentially interviewing for the job of taxi driver with the Joe Spinell character at the beginning, and we see Wizard and another someone talking in the window in the back there. There are other details of that I think are really interesting. One of which being the fact that he was what was it? It was an honorable discharge, May 1973, if I remember correctly. He was in the Marines, and then Joe Spinell says, I was in the Marines, and that's actually an interesting point too, because at that moment, it's almost like the fact that the two of them were also had similar military experience is the point in which the film slightly changes, if you notice, and the camera, which up to that point had been stationary. There was a quick shot of a kind of a close up to Travis's face, but for the most part, the camera was pretty stationary when it was on Joe Spinell. But at the moment when Joe Spinell's character says, like, me too, then he gets into the second part, the more meatier part of the conversation or the scene, which is, why do you want to do this? Right? And if you notice, that's the point where the camera starts to move and glide along Joe Spinell's character. And I would suggest that the camera as well is used in a way, when you see this, it's used in a way as a kind of transition, but also as a marker or an indication of the potential of a connection between Travis Bickle on the one hand and another human being on the other hand. It's quite an interesting use of the cinematic concept of the camera as a kind of almost meditation on existentialism in cinema, if you will, or the idea of existences between characters. But that does come up after the revelation, the quick revelation that Travis makes that he was honorably discharged from military service in May 1973. And now the film starts, or at least his inner monologue starts in May 10th. That's the first diary entry that we get from him. So I don't know if we can make too much of that May, but we can, as Jared points out so correctly, I think, we have to keep in mind that he does have some kind of military service, and we cannot know exactly what that entailed, of course, because we never get any of that information in the film directly. But we can sort of glean, or we can look at the way that Robert De Niro delivers those lines. There's a slight hesitation, I don't want to say discomfort perhaps, but there is a little bit of hesitation there that could make one believe or lead one to the conclusion that maybe there is something to Jared's point about PTSD and the military experience creating the basis for some kind of trauma, if you will, that is playing itself out in real terms in the world of the film Taxi Driver. And so, yes, I think that's a very important little detail. It's never a direct thing that is spoken of, excuse me, but it is something that I think has been mentioned by Martin Scorsese in discussions of the film, of course. But in terms of what's presented as information within the context of the film itself, that's the only bit of information that we get. But it does explain also Travis's seeming familiarity with guns and firearms. He seems to almost immediately know how to handle the firearms when he's meeting with the firearms dealer in the hotel or in the room there. And he seems to be he seems to be able to handle himself very well with those weapons. So, yeah, so that's a very good point, Jared, for bringing that up. And then Tim says, yeah, before I forget, there's one other thing that I should mention about that little moment. If I might forget later, so I'll just mention it now, which is there's a little detail in that introductory scene where Travis is interviewing for the job of becoming a taxi driver. Do you remember when he's asked about his education? And then Travis says, some, or here and there, just tries to brush off the question, something that he doesn't really want to get into. I think that's a really interesting moment. I could have seen that be played out in so many different ways, and it could have just been a throwaway line, It could have been scripted in a way to say, he just went to some college, dropped out or something, joined the military. Okay, and it could have been a throwaway line. Or it could have been that, I dropped out when I was in high school or something like that. Or I graduated from such and such a place and I went here. And it could have just been a throwaway line. But for whatever reason, the filmmakers and the actor at that moment decided to express this part of Travis, his formal education, in this way, some here and there, which I think can be interpreted in many ways, I think, but primarily one of two ways. First way is that Travis is an uneducated, naive person. Okay, we can interpret that moment to mean that he is naive and he is not educated. Or we can interpret that also as that maybe he experienced some kind of difficulty or trauma or something with his education himself. I mean, there are moments where he does seem to suggest, there seem to be moments in the film where it could be suggested that, in fact, he is not educated. There are moments like that. But there are other moments in the film where he seems to be quite educated and he seems to be quite intelligent about certain aspects of the world. And so, I don't know, it's very difficult for me to get a real sense as to how best to interpret this particular point in the film. And this is an example of how complicated I think Travis Bickle as a character is, and how difficult it is for me to really get a handle as to what he is about or who he is. And I think it's that little moment, it's such a small moment, but it's so telling for me in so many ways. And let's see. Wolfgrat says, I also listened to the Scorsese commentary, loved his reference to Jack Palance's Dissolve in Shane. Yes. Jared says, I think De Niro should have won the Academy Award for this film. His performance is truly a powerhouse to watch. And Wolfgrat says, it was even more shocking in 1976. And Cine Arts is here. Hello. Hi, friend. Taxi Driver is one of my 100 favorite films, a true masterpiece. Not quite my favorite Scorsese, but top 4. I think Raging Bull is possibly his finest film. Scorsese is a genius. JBDS here does. Taxi Driver is a classic, and I enjoyed it from start to finish, and I have it on Blu-ray, and I enjoy the whole story as it unfolds. Let's see here. There you go. And Robert De Niro is fab as Travis, but I think the part of Jodie Foster steals the show as the young prostitute. Yes, Jodie Foster's performance here is incredible, absolutely incredible for a number of reasons. And I think it's a really it's a very delicate balance that the filmmakers achieve with that particular role. I mean, I think we all know the background of that, and Jodie Foster, the actor's age at the time, and the character's age at the time. It's really quite controversial in terms of the subject matter. Excuse me. excuse me, I just want to clear my throat there. But the Jodie Foster character, I think, is done really well. It's depicted very well and handled quite delicately, but it still leaves so much open in our minds as to the horrors of this particular part of the story. It's a really just gross and horrible situation. And I think and I go back to that scene between her and Harvey Keitel when they're alone. It's just that is one of the creepiest things I've seen in a film in some time. Really, really creepy. You know, I mean, I understand that there were some parts of the filmmaking process which wanted to try to give Sport, the character, some room for sympathy. And I think the scene was designed perhaps in order to achieve that. But I think it achieves quite the contrary. I think it solidifies one's view of Sport as a true exploiter of this young girl and the monster that he is, and the real victim that she is. But also I think it's a very important scene because it shows the pull that Sport has over Iris and the kind of... that's the reason why it is not so easy, or it's one of the reasons why it's not so easy perhaps for Iris to just simply get up and go away from this, because there is a kind of dependency that she has on him that we see play itself out in that particular scene. You know, she needs something from this, and she seems to feel like she is getting some kind of emotional connection with the Sport character. I mean, of course, I think we can all agree that it's a very misplaced, misguided view of the world by this young girl, of course. But I think that's one of the main reasons for that particular scene being in there. But of course, it just also highlights the fact that Sport as a character is a real monster. But it also highlights the greatness of the Jodie Foster performance and just how fine a balance she was able to achieve with that, as well as the other filmmakers in there. It's really wonderful. But let me just go back to my earlier comments and about how we can view this film. And I think I mentioned it as a sort of internal and external drama, and I also mentioned the idea of a horror film. And also I think this is a film that is a meditation on loneliness. Travis indeed calls himself, he says at the middle of the film in one of his diary entries to himself, right? There is no escape, not escape. There is no escape. I'm God's lonely man. And so that is in many ways the almost thesis of the film, if you like. That is the tagline of the film, right? God's lonely man. It's a very powerful description, I think, of what this film is, which is, as I say, a meditation on loneliness. But I think if we go down and we think about the character of Travis, I think we can see that this idea of loneliness is a little bit more complicated than one might think, or at least what I might think at first blush. And this will be good because this hopefully will lead into a discussion or ability to discuss the Travis Bickle character as well. But, okay, let's think about this, right? Of course, Travis as a character is depicted as being, he's on his own. He is living by himself, of course. He seems to be writing in his diary about his job as a taxi driver. His job as a taxi driver itself is also something that insulates him from the outside world, but it also separates him from the outside world in a way, and he doesn't connect with anyone face to face. It's always him in the road, and his back is to the customers there, the people who are riding the taxi. He always looks at them through the rear view mirror, of course, but everything is just one directional, and so there is no way of him connecting through that means. It's just so therefore that further augments or highlights his isolation. And the taxi cab, I think as Paul Schrader described it, it's almost the perfect metaphor, this idea of isolation. And isolation begets loneliness, of course. But the question is, right, that I have, is the loneliness that Travis... Oh, I'm sorry, and before I get into that, just to further flesh out the discussion of this, which is, as a lonely character, we see him trying to reach out to other characters here. I think most crucially, his attempts to reach out to Betsy, and his attempts, right, I think we can all agree that he is attracted to her, he is sexually attracted to her, he wants to have a kind of emotional and physical connection with this woman, Betsy. And there's some time in the film, albeit very briefly, where it seems like it is something that is being reciprocated to a certain level anyway. Betsy agrees to go out with him to coffee, and where Travis had the apple pie with a slice of melted cheese, which he thought was a real good choice, and they have a little discussion there. But and of course later when he invites her to the disastrous adult movie theater date. So, but there are attempts of trying to reach out, and there are moments where he is not necessarily alone, but it, of course, then it just unravels and disintegrates into a further situation of loneliness, where he almost becomes a sort of passive observer, even though he's trying desperately to get some kind of connection with Betsy. With the very famous scene with him on the phone, and the camera tracks to the empty hallway. Also, when he's trying to just get some sense, and he can't get it through this line with Betsy, and his life slowly unravels as a result, I think. But we also see him unable to connect with, let's say, necessarily with Wizard and Doughboy and Charlie T and that cabbie world. There's a scene where he's walking into a cafe and they're all talking at a table already, and he goes in, he has to get a ticket from the little ticket counter, and he pulls it, and it makes a big noise, and he goes in. If you notice, they're all talking at the table, Wizard and Doughboy and Charlie T, and there's some other cabbies there that I don't know the names of, but they're all talking in real time. Travis is in the back getting his food. Notice closely, Travis is in slow motion. It's in slow motion whenever it gets to Travis, but then it's in real time when Wizard is talking to the other guys. And so that visual motif is a nice way of showing us visually that Travis is like one note off from the rest of the world almost. So that further solidifies his loneliness in visual terms, which is great. So the loneliness in visual terms is shown in the way in which he drives a taxi, in the visual terms, in that sometimes he's shown in slow motion, whereas the people around him are talking in real time. It's also shown in the way that two shots, dialogue scenes between two characters are composed, going back to the conversation with Betsy. It doesn't happen all the time, but for most of the conversation, Travis is blocked off. You have the two of them sitting at a table by the window. Whenever it cuts to him, at least in the first part of the conversation, it's just him, isolated, and he is not seen. There's no mention, or there's no area where Betsy is seen over the shoulder or anything like that. It's just him. But then when so that seems to further cement his isolation and loneliness in visual terms. There is a moment, though, in that conversation, I think in the latter half of the conversation, just for a little bit, where she is talking about you remind me of that song by Chris Christopherson. And it's that moment where we get a real nice close-up of Travis, which is of a slightly different angle, and we actually see a little bit of the back of her head or her shoulder. So we do see a little bit of Betsy included in a shot of Travis, if you will. And I think that's great, because that particular moment in the conversation, I think that's a moment where they really kind of connect almost, where she's really in a sense, getting at the psychology of Travis Bickle in a way that I think is so key for me in trying to understand who Travis is. And so I think it's only fitting that we see a little bit of human connection, if you will, that little bit of Betsy's shoulder as we see a shot of Travis. It's almost as though Travis is able to make a connection with another human being at that moment, whereas the rest of the film, for the most part anyway, he seems to be isolated in his conversations, even with people. The same is true, I think, for his conversation with Iris when he's talking later in the cafe with Iris for breakfast for her, because she gets up at 1 o'clock, of course. So whenever it cuts to him, it's always isolated. He is by himself in the frame, and so that again it presents us in visual terms this idea that he is an isolated, lonely character. Now, the question I have is this loneliness that is being experienced by Travis Bickle, is this loneliness, is this a self-imposed loneliness, or is it an involuntary loneliness? Now, the reason why I ask this is I get very mixed signals from this film on this particular point, and I don't quite know the answer. On the one hand, it seems like Travis wants some kind of human connection, but he is unable to get it. Therefore, it can be said that his loneliness is involuntary. In other words, he wants to be with people, but he is unable to do so. Case in point, his attempts at trying to get with Betsy, the Sybil Shepherd character. That's where he is actively seeking out some kind of connection. I think the same can be said for his trying to actively seek out a kind of resolution to Iris's situation. So I think in those two situations, who are the two main female characters in this film, and I think that's no coincidence, I think we have Travis actively trying to make some kind of connection with another human being. Okay, so therefore his inability to express that in any, let's say, normal way could be seen perhaps as being a kind of inability to connect. Therefore his loneliness by extension can be said to be involuntary or not self-imposed. In other words, he wants to make a connection and he's unable to in normal terms. Okay. And that leads, let's go back to the Betsy story. And because of his inability to connect with her, that leads further to his sense of loneliness. And that can be said to lead him down a path that leads to him wanting to attack Charles Palantine. Okay. I think that holds water very well. But there are other moments in the film where I don't quite know if it's involuntary or not. In other words, it could be said that perhaps his loneliness is self-imposed. It's almost like he is voluntarily, almost on a self-destructive bent, imposing the sense of loneliness upon himself. Now, why do I say this? I go back to his relationships with Betsy and Iris. We get a Travis there that I would suggest is very outgoing. He is very assertive, almost to the point of being quite confident with himself. He does seem a little bit buffoonish perhaps when he's first trying to pick up Betsy, but I don't know, there's a certain charm to him as well. There is a strong strength, I would suggest, in the way he is asserting himself with Iris and how he is wanting to essentially save her. So that is a very, different kind of Travis than the kind of Travis that would lend me to believe that his loneliness is all involuntary. So those sorts of clues in his character can lead me at least to think that maybe parts of his loneliness are in fact voluntarily imposed upon himself. For what reason? Why would he want to do this under this interpretation? Why would he want to do this? Okay, well, we know that he has this view of the world. Just that shocking opening monologue that he has, all the animals come out at night monologue. And he says, after he spews out all this stuff, he says, it's all sick vino. And he says, someday a real rain will come and wash all the scum off the streets, right? That's what he says, right? So he obviously has a kind of antagonism against the world for whatever reason. Now, are these based on racist tendencies of the Travis Bickle character? This is something that I do want to get into later, but I think it is possible that there are racist tendencies within Travis Bickle. I mean, it is possible that he is a racist, and the film doesn't outwardly show this, I think, although there are strong indicators that suggest this. Okay. Those feelings that include also the possibility, and I think that we can debate whether he is or not, but I think he is, but in terms of his attitudes towards African Americans. But let's just take a step back from that for now and just say, just his attitude towards the outside world. It is all a hell, right? And that's what he says to Betsy, right? You're in a hell, and you're going to die in the hell like the rest of them, right? So he is coupling her with the rest of the world, so to speak. And he has almost a strong, vehement hatred, if you will, of the world around him, a real disgust for the world. That could be a psychological basis for him wanting to have a self-imposed kind of loneliness, okay? There's also this kind of theory or view of the film that I think has been posited by none other than, when I say Paul Schrader, where he's talking about, and I think Martin Scorsese as well, and he's talking about the reasons why, for example, Travis took Betsy to the adult movie theater to begin with. I mean, one would think this is a really stupid thing to do if you want to impress someone on what is essentially a first date. You don't want to take them to an adult movie theater. So what the heck was Travis thinking, right? And we can always go to the point where maybe he's really, really gullible and naive as a character, and he really didn't know. And he seems to say that, I didn't know about this. I see couples watching this kind of film all the time. And in fact, I think we see in the theater, sitting in a row in front of them, we see a couple watching the adult movie as Betsy wants to leave the theater. And so, it could be that he is just painfully naive. But a theory that's been posited by some of the filmmakers is that this was almost a purposeful, self-destructive act on the part of Travis Bickle himself. At the cusp of him being able to perhaps attain some kind of human connection with another human being, here a woman to whom he is apparently physically and emotionally attracted. Travis Bickle makes this decision. And so it's almost seen like a sort of self-sacrifice type of thing, which is suggesting that it was done maybe not necessarily on purpose, but it was done almost on a subconscious level on purpose in order to be able to avoid or to destroy any hope of a human connection that he might have had with Betsy at that point in the film. In other words, the act of going to the adult movie theater was, even on a self-conscious level, almost a self-sacrificial or self-destructive act on the part of Travis. Therefore, if we can look at that act in those terms, in that way, then we can see that perhaps the fact that he becomes lonely or lonelier after that moment makes that loneliness post Betsy almost a self-imposed or self-initiated loneliness. Therefore, the loneliness in the film is not involuntary, but it is in fact a self-imposed loneliness. I don't know what you think about this, but I think it depending on how I view or how I answer that question, I think the film changes for me, and its thrust, if you will, changes for me. I think it becomes a like if it becomes an involuntary loneliness, then the film almost acts like, the inside versus the outside, if you will, and his rage is almost, from his point of view, a kind of primal scream, if you will, venting all the frustrations in an almost frenzied, orgasmic fashion. That the end result, the final scene, clearly is. But if we look at the film as a sort of self-imposed loneliness, then I think we can see the final act also in terms of a self-destructive nature. And we see all of the developments of the narrative from this early point in the film to the final climax to be moments of self-destruction, which I think create a real complicated psychological profile of Travis Bickle. Almost self-aware Travis Bickle, which, if that's the case, that makes his character even more complicated for me to interpret, because it means that he has, on the one hand, a self-awareness that perhaps suggests an inherent, inherent almost strength and intelligence, if you will. Because it does, I would suggest that it does require a good degree of intelligence and self-awareness, or intelligence to have this level of self-awareness. And we go back to that moment at the very start of the film, what was your education, Travis? Some here, there. It makes that line also quite a loaded line. And I think then the unraveling in terms of how we can then link all these little moments up, I think it becomes almost endless. And so I don't know what you think about that. I think it's an interesting proposition to think about. But let me just stop there, and because I've been talking too long here, and let me just go back to the chat here and see what it is you have to say. So let's see. I select 101. Hello, it's nice to see you. And you say definitely a great film, no doubt. Thank you. I'm going to skip around here slightly, just in the interest of time. Let's see. Okay, Andre says Taxi Driver is my favorite film of all time. That's great. What a great choice, my friend. Robert De Niro gives a powerful performance. Yes, I agree 1,000%. Carl is here. Carl Reese, hello. My favorite Scorsese film. I love a good dark character study. Yes. And Jared continues, I see this film as a psychological thriller, very intense drama. Let's see. And Nazim Prod, hello. Let's see. Marcus Walker, greetings from the UK. Well, hello, Marcus. It's nice to see you. Goose in my caboose. Ola, hello. Night Loner Film Reviews. It's nice to see you, my friend. Our friend, Night Loner Film Reviews. I hope you're well. You say, Taxi Driver is my favorite film. That's a great choice to have, my friend. Really great. Carl says Scorsese has a great cameo in this. Decent little actor. In fact, he has two cameos, right? The main cameo that he has, of course, is what I think you're referring to, is a bit in the Taxi and the 44 Magnum, which is a really wow, what a monologue that is. And I think that's so suggestive of how De Niro just reacts that moment when he just looks at him through the rearview mirror and just pushes the rearview mirror. Love that moment when he says, I don't want to repeat the lines, or I think they're quite foul, but he says, what can a 44 Magnum pistol do, right? And I love those. That's a great thing too. That's another link to Psycho also, when he's talking about the woman in the window. Right? Psycho has a very famous thing with women in the window, a certain woman in the window of a certain house, and I think this is a similar kind of setup, and it's great too, because it further elongates or antagonizes the very delicate psychological situation that Travis is already in right now. He has already been rejected by Betsy at this point, and this is, I think, where he first gets the idea of the 44 Magnum. right? Because that's what the Scorsese customer says. And later on, when he's asking to buy guns, the first thing he asks for is a 44 Magnum. I think this is the thing. This is, I think, another example of this idea of the externalities and the external stimuli influencing Travis. I mean, things that he picks up from the outside world is things that he then internalizes. I think Scorsese's thing with the 44 Magnum is one example. Another example, of course, is Betsy and Palantine. After Travis starts to become familiar with Betsy, then he himself becomes excited for Charles Palantine, and he even says so when Charles Palantine actually is in his taxi cab, which is an interesting coincidence. I would suggest that, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but what was I saying? Yeah, so Scorsese and his acting cameo here. He actually appears earlier in the film too, when we first see Betsy. She emerged from the crowd and she's seen walking in slow motion into the Palantine campaign offices there in New York. He's sitting on the ledge or the stoop there, and he's got his knee up and he's just looking, and he looks as Betsy's walking in. And so that's an interesting little thing there as well. I think the plan, according to the background details of this film as shown in the documentary and the commentary, is that I think it wasn't initially planned that Scorsese would play the part of that in that taxi cab there, but he ended up doing so at the last minute due to some other circumstances involving the other actor who was planned to play that role. But it is certainly a great role, and I love how Scorsese is directing De Niro. Put it down. Keep the meter on. Put it down. What would I say? Leave the meter on. So he's directing De Niro as we are watching the film unfold, and I love that little moment. It's a meta moment, if any. That's one of the tough moments of the film. And in fact, that then leads to if I'm correct, that leads to the scene in the diner, and that's where Travis asks to talk to Wizard, and that's where Travis first explains to Wizard, he's got some bad ideas, and then Wizard gives that really, I think, it's such a good-willed, totally inadequate response, like a guy becomes his life or something, right? Guys live here, guys live there. It becomes who they are, right? And that's and I think Travis says, that's some of the dumbest thing that he ever heard, right? But I think the point is that after the Scorsese scene in the taxi, that's where we really get Travis expressing to another character that he's starting to have really dark ideas in his head. So I think we can say that the external stimuli that was, I think, given part and parcel from this exchange with Scorsese in the taxi is one of the reasons why he is going down this path of using firearms, and then eventually uses firearms in a very violent way. But you're right to point that out, Carl. Very, very good. Yes, Nazarin says Travis, he is very much an unreliable narrator. Yes, I agree completely. He doesn't understand himself, his own society. Now that I think there is, on the one hand I do agree with that, but on the other hand I would suggest that there is something of a possible interpretation in the opposite direction. But I think for the most part I agree with you. Everything is warped, even if he is not lying. Yes, he is, but I definitely agree with you in the fact that he is an unreliable narrator. It's an interesting tool that is being used here, right? We see him monologuing, which we assume to be his writings or diary, but sometimes he's writing a card to his parents or something like that. But it's mostly monologuing. When he's writing the card to his parents, he does have a number of lies in there already. For instance, he says he's been going with a girl named Betsy for some months, which is, of course, a lie. He is also, there's a moment where he is monologuing during the famous You Talking to Me scene. He says, he does that thing, here is a man who would not have, and he would not let, and it cuts and then it goes back and it does a little rerun of that, which is a really nice, almost French New Wave moment. That's great. But later on, immediately after that, there is a moment where he says, here is a man who stood up, and he says, and it cuts to the close-up of the diary, here is, da-da-da, and he says to himself in the mirror, very self-destructive moment perhaps, you're dead. But I love that moment in that when he says, and here is someone who stood up, and it shows him lying on his bed, on his cot. Physically speaking, of course, he's not being shown standing up, he's being shown lying down. So even during his high frenzied, edited monologue there, he is kind of lying. And so I think that is another indication, or another example, if you will, of how we can see him as being an unreliable narrator. Now, I don't think it's true all the time, but I don't think we can take everything that he says at face value, and I think the film is very careful to give us leads in that direction, very rightly so. But you're right, Nazim Prad. I do agree with you about the unreliable narrator part. Incidentally, of course, I would suggest that that kind of process of showing a character writing and saying is very similar to Robert Bresson. I mean, we've seen characters in Robert Bresson films, in particular Diary of a Country Priest and Pickpocket, express similar modes of communication vis-a-vis the cinematic communication with the audience. And so I would also posit that perhaps there are some methods of unreliable narration going on, for instance, in Bresson's Pickpocket, just as we have here in Taxi Driver. So it's an interesting little cinematic technique, harkens back to early French cinema, and we know that Martin Scorsese and indeed Paul Schrader have a great fondness for Robert Bresson. He wrote a book on it too. So anyway, so what was I saying? So let me now just very quickly, as quick as I can, just now go into, this is interesting, go into this idea of, well, actually, how should I do this? Sorry, I've just lost my train of thought. What should I do next? I think we can go, okay. Actually, this might be a good time to go into the filmmaking and the cinematic style of the film. I mentioned Bresson, and so I think we can all say, or we can all agree, that this is one of the most unique, frenzied shot films in terms of its style and the cinematic tricks that it employs. I would even go so far as to suggest, with all due respect to the film Citizen Kane, of course, but I would suggest that this film holds so much riches. There's something that's said about the film Citizen Kane that one watches it a lot, and every time one watches it, one sees something new, in the sense that there are so many tricks that are included in that film Citizen Kane, that you discover new things upon a rewatch of that film. Well, I would suggest that the same is true for the film Taxi Driver, in that there are so many tricks of cinema going on within the world of this film and the way it's shot. So much so that I think every time I view it, I'm startled, even now, at the things that I discover for the first time, even though I have seen the film many times. And I think those little tricks of cinema are not just tricks for the sake of making tricks, but I think those tricks are done with a purpose, and they are done with the idea of trying to express or link to some aspect of the psychology of Travis Bickle, or the situation of where he finds himself here in New York, that sort of thing. In other words, I think that all the cinematic tricks are used in a way to further the exploration of Travis Bickle as his character, and they are not done for the sake of showing off one's cinematic prowess, if you will. And I think this is very, very good. So one thing I would draw your attention to is the way in which dissolves are used, the way in which slow motion is used, and the way in which camera pans are used. Okay, so the first one is dissolves. One of the most striking early dissolves in the film, if you recall, is after Travis has left the taxi driver interview and he's seen walking out of the office and he's seen walking out into the street. It's just him by himself walking down the sidewalk. It suddenly dissolves to the same shot, but just maybe a few seconds later. And Travis is now seen walking still in the same area, again, but just a few seconds later, and now seen drinking out of a bottle of some kind. We're not quite sure what that bottle is, but it could be liquor, I'm not sure. But that's an interesting little technique, right? Because then it goes into, the music starts, and then it goes into his inner monologue, and the film cuts to a slow glide through Travis's room as we hear him talking. And he says, thank God for the rain, which has helped wash away all the garbage and the trash off the sidewalks. And that's such an interesting moment because it's very unusual in a kind of Hollywood film to dissolve within the same scene. This is something that I think is an example of how this film is seen in a kind of, it's using what might be noted as being tricks of cinema that were famously employed by certain filmmakers in the French New Wave. Godard, I think, being the prime example. But even within, so I would suggest, for instance, that dissolve that occurs mid-scene is very important because it almost helps to leap into the interior monologue of Travis. In other words, we cut to the outside and Travis is walking, and this is an outside shot. So this is almost like the camera is acting like a third party to Travis, and it's not yet penetrated the inner sanctum, if you will, of Travis's psychology. But by virtue of a dissolve in the same scene, and the start of the music, and then we cut into the next shot and the interior monologue begins, that dissolve almost acts like a way of accessing Travis's inner sanctum or inner monologue. So the dissolve, if we look at it that way, the dissolve acts like a way of getting inside Travis's head, and which I think is a very interesting way of looking at it. The same is true, I think, for the idea of, or the similar thing is going on with slow motion. I mentioned earlier the scene around the middle of the film where I think it comes after the Scorsese cameo in the taxi cab, but it's when Travis is entering the cafe and Wizard and the other cabbies are already sitting at a table talking. They're talking in real time, but Travis, if you notice, it's almost imperceptible, but he is moving in slow motion. So he is moving in a different temporal space than the rest of the people. And so that is a very, I think, unusual thing to do where it cuts back and forth almost. So it's almost, I think the conventional thing to have done would be to have Travis in regular time in sync with the rest of the cabbies. But the rest of the cabbies are in real time, and then Travis himself is in almost imperceptible slow time or slow motion time. And now this is something that I think is a very interesting cinematic trick, but it's not a trick just to show off. It is a trick to show the fact that Travis is indeed becoming isolated even from his other cab friends, which is a very important development in the narrative. It comes around the middle of the film, and then from here he becomes even more isolated, Then there are these ideas of the way in which the camera pans and tracks. And let me go back to the first sequence of the film, namely Travis and his interview, and he walks out of the office. This is an interesting thing. If you notice, again, I'm sorry I can't do playback on these videos here, but if you go back to the film, at the very beginning, after he finishes his interview, he walks out of the office. It actually shows him, shows him walking out, and then he walks off camera. And then the camera follows, not him, but it follows Wizard, as Wizard walks out slowly to one of the cabs and maybe goes over to talk to someone. And it goes like this. And it just follows the cabs, and Travis isn't there. It just follows the cabs and goes like this, and then suddenly it goes here, and then Travis is seen standing there, and he walks out of the building and onto the street. The conventional thing that would have been done, I would suggest, would be to have Travis walk out and the camera following Travis in the foreground as he is looking out towards the cabbies, and he's walking to the exit and he walks up. That would have been the conventional thing, but the camera starts with Travis. Travis walks off camera, and then the camera just goes off almost by itself, following Wizard of all people. And then it goes to the other end, and then he picks up Travis again, who kind of walked behind the camera. In that sense, a similar thing is happening in the very famous sequence where Travis is talking on the payphone in the hallway there, and he's trying to reach Betsy after that disastrous date, and he's saying, are you okay? And he's trying to invite her to dinner again, but it's not going to happen, of course. And it's such a pathetic moment for Travis, of course. And the camera then tracks away from him to the empty hallway, which then leads out into a small glimpse of the outside street there as he's talking. These are examples of the camera tracking and panning, again, to suggest the isolation of Travis Bickle, I would suggest. Also, in a very interesting way, it's almost like the camera is its own actor in the film. And it's acting, therefore, in a way that it is almost ignoring Travis, or it doesn't even care about Travis and covering Travis. I mean, if it cared about Travis, it would have stayed on Travis during that phone call. It would have maybe gone up close into his face, seeing his reaction as he's trying to talk to Betsy, who's on the other line. It doesn't do that. The same is true for that introductory sequence where the camera just almost loses Travis only to pick him up again, almost by chance, if you will, and then he goes out. So it's almost like the camera is itself its own actor, and that is, I think, very significant because it almost connects to what Nazrin Prod was saying earlier in the live chat about how Travis is an unreliable narrator. Well, the other side of the coin is that the camera and Travis are two separate things, right? So therefore, not everything that we see transpiring or occurring within the world of Travis Bickle, not everything that we are seeing might not necessarily be true to what Travis is actually thinking, because the camera doesn't necessarily, at these moments anyway, go into his head. It is outside of Travis, and it is so outside of Travis that it doesn't even bother to follow him during some moments of the film. Okay, if that's the case, then I think we have an even richer, more complicated way that this film can operate, right? Because the film weaves in and out, I would suggest, from sort of a non-omniscient view of Travis Bickle, let's say a view from the outsider point of view of Travis Bickle, as an outsider would see Travis Bickle. And then it goes into a slightly omniscient perspective from Travis's point of view as to what his thoughts and feelings are. But it doesn't always operate that way. It tends to go back and forth, vacillate between these two situations or these two positions. This is very important too, because I think the film, as it transpires, does not make itself very easy to interpret as to what could potentially be real and what could potentially be Travis's imagination. Now, I haven't spoken about this yet, but I think this kind of filmmaking is right. It lends itself to the ability to see the film as potentially being, at least in part anyway, a kind of figment of Travis's imagination. And if that's the case, then we can look at parts of this film and we can see them as being, at least potentially, things that didn't happen in real life. Now, again, I don't think the film presents this clearly, or it doesn't. I'm not clearly, but it doesn't present it in a definitive manner, which means that it's left to us, the viewers, to think, how we can interpret this. But I think the fact that we have a camera that is not always omniscient means that we can at least consider the possibility that some aspects of the film are indeed figments of Travis's imagination. I think most famously the sequence at the end. This is the end after the bloodbath, and he has shot Sport, he has shot the guy in the stairway, he shot the mafia guy, and all this, and he tries to shoot himself, but he realizes he doesn't have any bullets left. But he's shot in the neck, and so this is a very, I think, significant injury, and he's seen losing quite a lot of blood. I would think that if one is shot in the neck like this, and one is bleeding quite heavily, as he is shown to be doing, and then he's seeing, after he does this very infamous hand gesture there with the thing, 3 times, I think, and then he's seen laying back on the sofa with a very inert expression on his face. And then the film cuts to an overhead shot, a slow overhead gliding shot. This has been suggested by some people as being almost Travis's point of view as he is dying. You know, this idea of you look on yourself at the point of death. And then everything that follows after that, it's all done in slow motion, and the music is the drum Bernard Herrmann music, which is sort of a new explosive piece we hadn't heard up to now in this film. And then after that, the film cuts to a very optimistic appraisal of Travis's actions. The cuttings of the newspaper suggest that he is depicted as a hero. This kind of vigilante justice that I think was very famous or infamous during this time in the 1970s and early 80s, perhaps. And so we have, but it's very obviously different from what we perceived to be the situation of Travis at the time, and we see Travis as being almost monstrous at this point, but he is depicted as a hero. It has been suggested that this is all a fantasy, this is all a kind of dream. Whether it's a dream that he's thinking at the point of death, I'm not sure, but it has been suggested that this is a fantasy, and so if it is, then I think we can also see that other parts of the film could be perhaps seen as fantasy as well. Now, I don't think the film is definitively clear on this point, so therefore I don't want to suggest that it is definitely a dream, but it could be a dream. It could be interpreted as a dream. Another aspect of the film that could be interpreted as a dream is in fact the storyline with Betsy and the storyline with Iris. This would help to explain why Travis is so assertive during these parts of the narrative, because it seems to be inconsistent with his character. If we take these moments to be figments of his imagination, namely his interactions with Betsy didn't exist in real time. Maybe the real character did exist, and she did see someone in the offices of the Palatine headquarters like this. We do see a shot of Travis when he first is seen looking at Betsy, and Betsy and Tom, the Albert Brooks character, saying, look out there, see that taxi driver, he's been staring at us. We get a shot of Travis looking through the window, and you see what he's doing. He's drinking a Coke, I think, or it's maybe Royal Crown Cola. Excuse me. Sorry, Diane Abbott, but maybe it's a Royal Crown Cola, which is very similar to this idea of drinking soda during a movie. For Travis, it would be adult films, but he does drink out of these cups, right? So it's almost like he is watching a movie when he's watching Betsy. And there's another moment before he goes out on his date with Betsy. We see him walking. It's a sideways shot of him walking, and we hear his zipper, and the sound on this, it's very pronounced. It's a very loud zip, and then it suddenly cuts abruptly to a head-on shot of Travis with his red blazer walking in slow motion. And this is, we understand, he is on his way to meet Betsy, and he's going to take him to the movie theater. But that, and then the Bernard Herrmann music is on at that moment. It's a slow motion shot. It's very striking. This is another way, I think, of using cinema technique, the idea of the slow motion, to perhaps suggest that the realm of the cinema, the realm of the film, and the realm of Travis and his own mind are two separate things. And I would even suggest that the abruptness of the shot, the edit from him zipping on his coat to him walking in slow motion like that, it could be suggestive of a kind of fantasy element to, or a possibility of a fantasy interpretation of this particular moment of the film. Right? And so it's so almost poetic, almost ballet-like in the movements and the beauty of that slow motion. It could be seen also as maybe a drawn-out last shot of Travis before his sort of destructive, disastrous moment in the film, perhaps. So it's a last moment of pondering of this last moment of innocence, perhaps. But I think it's something more than that. And I would even suggest the possibility, at least, of this being the entry point into the fantasy element of the film. Namely, this idea that he's going to have a date with Betsy. And if it is indeed a fantasy, then that, I think, lends more credence to, I think, the Paul Schrader view of this act being a self-conscious, self-destructive act, because it's almost like, that happens sometimes in films where you have a narrator dreaming or fantasizing about something and he or she is unable to have bliss or happiness in his or her own fantasies. His or her own psychological condition is such that even in his or her own fantasies, things fall apart. And so I don't want to suggest that this is a definitive view of this film, but I think that the way in which the camera and cinematic techniques are employed by Scorsese and crew can create the basis for the possibility of interpreting the film in these certain ways. Now, do I buy these interpretations outright? I think it's hard for me to say with 100% confidence, but I do think the possibility is there, and therefore I think the film is really quite remarkable. I mean, let me just end with some other miscellaneous points on this. But the technique is really quite fascinating. You notice how some shots are repeated. For instance, there's a shot where Travis and Iris are entering into the building, and it tracks upwards towards the top of the building, and then cuts into the dark, grimy hallway. But then that shot, if you notice, is repeated. It's used again. Do you know where it's used? It's used where after Travis and Iris have their breakfast and they have their discussion, it then cuts to the shot of it. Then it leads into the sequence between Iris and Sport alone, and Iris says, "I don't like what I'm doing, Sport." Well, before that, the transition, if you remember, is a shot of Travis's face kind of gliding down, I think, and we hear little bongo drums on the soundtrack, and then it cuts to a shot of the building going up. That's the same shot that was used previously. You can tell because you actually can see Travis and Iris walking into the entrance as it's panning up, so it's the exact same shot. The shots are shots that are repeated. Also, and I'm almost positive that this is the case, but I can't be sure, I can't verify this, but the opening shot of the smoke and the taxi riding through the smoke, and it says taxi driver, and it has that that moment there. That I think is a shot that is actually used later in the film. It looks like it is it is cropping a shot that is used of the taxi driving through some sewer mist. This is after. Please look again. This is a quick shot of the taxi driving. This is after Iris first enters the taxi for the first time, and she says, come on, get out of here. But then Sport comes in and intervenes at the last minute. And then Travis is seen driving off. And this is, I'm sorry, in the context of the narrative, Travis has picked up Charles Palantine, and he's talked to Charles Palantine, and then drops him off. And then we see at another point, Iris comes in and she says, "Come on, let's get out of here." But then Sport intervenes and he drives off. And then there's a moment where Travis is seen driving, and then there's suddenly a moment where these these young African American youths. I think they're African American. I forget, but they're seen throwing like eggs and trash at the taxi cab, which is an interesting little detail. Before that, at that moment, before that, after Iris is in the taxi cab, but before those kids throw the junk at the car, there's a little bit where the taxi is seen driving through some mist. I think that it's that same shot that is used for the opening titles, and it's just cropped and it's used in ultra slow motion. I think that's the same, but I can't be sure. It looks the same to me, but or maybe it's a different take. I'm not sure, but it feels very similar. And there's also another repeated shot. If you notice, there's a bit where that same thing where Iris is first seen and she runs into the cabin. She says, "Come on, let's go," and we see a shot of Travis, his eyes through the rear view mirror. And if you notice, it's kind of in slow motion, I think. If you notice, that same shot is used at the very end where Travis is dropping Betsy off for the last time. We see a shot of him and his eyes through the rearview mirror. Actually, that's the same shot that's being used, or it's the same take that's being used. You can tell because there's a little bit of light that is in the shape of a crescent that's under the actual rear view mirror thing there as well. It's right there in the right-hand part of the thing. And you can tell that it's the same shot. So it's an interesting method of using and reusing same shots or shots from the same takes at different points of the film that creates a kind of almost weird, like, oh, I've seen this before, but I don't quite know where, kind of feeling. And it makes the film, I think, even more charged and arresting in terms of a viewing experience. So, and that's also, I think, a further indication of the kind of cinematic technique that is being used here. I'm sorry, I'll go back to the chat in a second, but I should just mention one thing here before I forget. It's a slightly different topic, but I also appreciate the fact that it's interesting how Travis seems to his psychology seems to disintegrate to the point where the focus of his anger is on the figure of Charles Palantine. Now, I mentioned the Charles Palantine exchange that he had in his taxi cab. It's an interesting depiction of a politician, is it not? I think it's a very smart way of depicting a politician, Charles Palantine. It would have been very easy, I think, to depict Palantine as being this corrupt character, this corrupt politician. Now, we don't get any details as to the politics of Charles Palantine. We get the sense of there's a mandatory welfare program. That's what Tom, the Al Brooks character, says at the beginning, right? That's the issue that should be pushed. And then Betsy says, emphasize the man and then the issue, and then she says, I did not forget sexy, that exchange. But that exchange suggests that there's a mandatory welfare program as part of Palantine's platform. And I understand also, therefore, that this is for the nomination to be the candidate for president. And so if this is the case, then this is 1976. And so these, therefore, are probably going to be, right, if it says 1975, 1976, then this probably means that Gerald Ford, Republican Gerald Ford, is in office as president, right? So we can assume, therefore, that the candidates that we see, it's Palantine, I think also Goodwin, the posters for Goodwin, I think his name is, are the candidates for the Democratic primary. That's the assumption that I have, which then I think it makes sense, because you would think that this idea of whatever mandatory welfare means, it probably is something that is consistent, at least with the Democratic platform, at least at that point in time. We have to remember also 1970, this is probably prior to the 1976 election, and this is probably indicating the 1976 election, which we know in real life the result was the Jimmy Carter was elected president. But what was I saying? So yes, so Charles Palantine, but as a politician, as he's depicted in the film, we don't know what his situation is. We see him talking to Travis, And we see, he says this thing where, learned a lot from riding in taxi cabs and all this. And we see the person sitting next to Charles Palantine kind of looking at him like, what are you talking about? This kind of thing. And when Charles Palantine and his advisor leaves the taxi cab, after he shakes hands with Travis, Travis says, "You're a good man. I know you're going to win." And then the senator thanks him and walks into the hotel. There's a little look that Charles Palantine gives. It's kind of, I don't know how to interpret it. It could be just a look like, oh gosh, we're late for our scheduled event or something like that. It could be meaningless. Or it could be a look of like, man, that taxi driver, that kind of look, It's hard to tell, but if it's the latter, then that might be suggesting that Charles Palantine is not necessarily the kind of politician that he is making himself out to be. And in fact, if you notice, we don't get anything from his speeches that we see anyway. All his speeches are not necessarily policy speeches. They're all just, for lack of a better word, they're just platitudes, and they're just speech rhetoric, rather than giving us any actual policy positions. We the people know that. I mean, he quotes Walt Whitman in his speech, which is kind of interesting little thing. Although I guess earlier on in the film, a wizard is seen mentioning Bertrand Russell. So I suppose in this universe, if a wizard is mentioning Bertrand Russell, then perhaps mentioning Walt Whitman in a presidential primary speech isn't all out of the ordinary, perhaps. But I guess. What was I saying? So my point is that Charles Palantine as a politician doesn't necessarily be seen as being depicted as a kind of evil, corrupt character. It would have been easy for the film to do that, but it I think very wisely shies away from that. But it leaves everything up to the imagination. And there's that little moment, as I suggested, that after he leaves the taxi cab, where it could have been that he's like, I don't really like this guy, but it's not clear. It's not clear. So perhaps, but it is clear that, at least from outer appearances anyway, that Charles Palantine is of a different class than Travis in terms of social classes. I mean, he's a senator, and he seems to be well dressed. He seems to take, he's well groomed and all that stuff. So the film doesn't go into an overt discussion on class, on social classes here in the United States. But I think there is something under the surface, something slightly bubbling perhaps, which is, again, not suggestive outright, but maybe something more of implicit perhaps. The other thing too is that I think, I mean, it's an interesting thing. If I think of mandatory welfare and what that could possibly pertain to, it's an idea of an expansion of a social welfare system, which would lead to, let's say, welfare benefits, or the expansion of welfare benefits. That's my own assumption. And if that's the case, then we could assume, I think quite reasonably so, that perhaps Charles Palantine's politics, at least on this point, are not so inconsistent with Travis Bickle. In other words, I could see Travis Bickle actually supporting Charles Palantine's policy, at least on this mandatory welfare program, if it is what I think it is. And so if that's the case, then it's kind of ironic that in the end, Palantine becomes the target of Travis's hostility. Of course, we know that there are reasons that are more fundamental to that part of the narrative than just Charles Palantine's politics. I mean, of course, we know that, but I just think it's an interesting, almost ironic touch to the narrative. Let's see. So let's go back to the chat here, because I'm just soaking up all the time here. I apologize for that. Okay, X24 Rider is here. Hello. Let's see. Still trying to hunt down any Criterion Laserdisc. I hope the Criterion Laserdisc is still available. I think I remember, when I was looking for these Laserdiscs some years back, maybe a few years back, they were still quite readily available. So I don't know about the market now, but hopefully they are. I wish you all the best with that. Let's see. Rob the Bobs Hello, it's nice to see you here. I hope you're well. And Daisuke, I could listen to you talk for hours. Well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. That's very kind of you. I hope you're well. And let's see. X24 Rider says, I really need to give this film another watch as it's been quite some time since I last saw it. And Tim Holmes says, oh yes, the score of this film is tremendous. Yes. Nick Burkett says, can you talk about the Laserdisc? Maybe not now, just another time, except to say that it does have the Martin Scorsese's, it has the Martin Scorsese commentary track that I think has been carried over into future or subsequent DVD and Blu-ray releases, and so it's really good. This happens to be the special edition of this. There are actually a number of special edition examples here. I have, let's see, there's this, and actually for whatever reason I have two other special editions with this separate cover. The contents are the same. This is the CAV, and then the CLV release, which is a single disc. We have this, and I have another copy of this for whatever. It's a long story, but then there's this, and then whoops, that's actually a different movie. So I pulled that out by accident. I apologize for that. But so yes, so there's actually, I understand, two separate cover versions of the CLV release and two separate cover versions for the CAV release. There's been some indication that perhaps that there's more than one cover version, but I haven't been able to track it down. So it's a little bit of an interesting story with respect to Criterion Laserdiscs and Taxi Driver. But maybe I'll bring it up in another video. But I'll try to do that if I have the time. Wolfgratz says he, meaning Bernard Herrmann, was a very interesting composer. I've got some of his more classically influenced stuff on vinyl. That score is really quite remarkable. That little, the saxophone theme that plays throughout, that kind of tension and release, but the release doesn't feel all that satisfying, if you know what I mean. There's a tension that's building and it just explodes, but it doesn't feel like a satisfying explosion, to put it in those terms, and it then repeats. And then that idea of something starting from nothing and then leading into this crescendo and climaxing in that way. I mean, it's exemplified so strikingly at the very end, when after Betsy leaves the taxi and we see the shot of Travis, the quick shot of him in his eyes and looking through the rearview mirror, and then right, and it cuts into the credits. The idea, I think, being suggested by Scorsese and others, is that they needed a little sting at the end to suggest that perhaps this thing that Travis did could happen again. And the idea was that Bernard Herrmann, according to the story on the documentary, right, Bernard Herrmann, one of the last things he did before he passed away was, and he needed, Scorsese and Schrader wanted to have this little last punctuation of the sensitivity of Travis at this moment, that this could happen again. And so I think there's this idea of using was it marimbas, I think, or the xylophone type instrument to sort of clang it down. And as you know, when you clang down the instrument, it goes like boom, and then it fades out. And then I think the idea was that when they first heard it, Scorsese and crew heard it, are we really supposed to use this? And then Bernard Herrmann said, almost as a throwaway comment, play it in reverse. And that's what they did. They played it in reverse, and it goes like that, right? Which is it mirrors so wonderfully the whole theme of Taxi Driver by Bernard Herrmann, the drum. It's the same thing. It's sort of building from nothing and crescendo into a sort of a huge climax. It's the same thing. So it's so fitting, and it fits the music landscape so well. I think it's really great. That score is great. You know, did you ever get that soundtrack on CD? I did when I was a kid, and it was interesting because it was one of those soundtracks where you had the music, and you could hear that theme, da 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 da, and it's weird because there's actually a closing moment to that theme that's never used in the film, and it sounds like it suddenly turns the theme into a major key, and it just ends it in a very triumphant, almost romantic way, which is so not the film. And I'm so glad that the film didn't include that final moment of that da 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 theme. If you listen to the CD, maybe you can find it on YouTube. Who knows? You can listen to that end. It really, it sounds like it's like a motif that Bernard Herrmann would use as a romantic climax in a Hitchcock film like Vertigo or something like that. So it doesn't make. I'm glad it wasn't included here. Also, the CD soundtrack, if you recall, for those of you who had it, it had little bits of the narrative. I'm sorry, not narrative, but the Travis Bickle monologue edited in there, and they had all the swear words edited out. I recall, and so it's kind of it's kind of a weird soundtrack. Gosh, it has a nice little almost disco version of that saxophone theme. I think it's called Betsy's theme. I forget, but it has a little disco version of that, which is also quite weird. I'm glad they didn't use that here. I'm glad that they used the classical musical instruments versions of the songs that were used here. Also, I just another detail before I go on. I love the details of how methodical this film is in terms of the presentation of information. As I said, Travis doesn't mention the .44 Magnum until he hears it for the first time from the Scorsese taxi cab ride. It's only then that's the first thing he mentions to the gun dealer. He says, "Do you have any .44 Magnums?" And he says, "No, it's a big gun." And then what else does he get? I'm not a gun expert or anything like that, but he gets he gets 4 guns, right? He gets a .44 Magnum, and he gets a 38 snub nose, and then he gets a Colt automatic 25, I think, Colt automatic, and he gets a Walther. And he uses the Walther. Well, it's interesting too. He then talks about 38s. Remember, he talks about 38s when he's talking to the Secret Service guy, and he gives his name. His name is Crinkle, and he lives on Hopper Avenue or something like that. He's talking, what kind of weapons do you have? Do you have 38s? Things like that. So that's the sort of thing where Travis is using what it is he's heard before, and he's just using it as part of his own dialogue. It's kind of an interesting way. He's almost like a sponge, if you will. I mean, I said I wouldn't want to talk about. I didn't want to talk about other films, but just forgive me this one indulgence. But the film, I don't know if you know The Big Lebowski. This dude is almost famous for that sort of absorbing and then acclimating of information. I think Travis Bickle is very much of the same cloth, if you will. Incidentally, right, he uses the Walther on the kid who's holding up the store, and then he loses that gun, and then he uses the snub nose, I think, to shoot what's his name, Harvey Keitel's character, Sport. It's in his pocket. The Magnum is in a holster, which is in here, right? Which is an interesting detail, right? Because remember when we see him at the Palantine speech, just right as Palantine has finished his speech and he's walking, and Travis is walking from the other direction, we see Travis reach into his pocket, or reach into his coat like this. The assumption, therefore, is that he was planning to use his Magnum, .44 Magnum on Charles Palantine, which, if that's the case, that is very impractical and also very frightening, quite gruesome. Right, because the 38 was in his pocket, and he had his Colt on his little thing that he constructed with the wrist there. So that's a very impractical thing to have done. If he really wanted, I mean, that could also be a suggestion that, did he really think that he really wanted to do this thing, to carry out this plan and shoot at a presidential candidate? If he really wanted to, he could have done it in a more, I mean, I hate to say it, but he could have done it in a more clandestine way with the smaller gun. And he could have done it in a way that wouldn't have attracted attention. But the fact that he actually has to reach into his pocket like this and pull out what I assume is the 44 means that maybe he didn't want to do it in the first place. Who knows? Maybe he wanted to get caught or something. I'm not sure. I'm totally speculating here, but I think we can, and that's just a great thing about this film. There's so much that we can get from just thinking about the little details, and the idea of what he uses for the guns and his weaponry. And I'm not, as I say, I'm not an expert in guns, but that's based on the information that we get from the gun dealer and all that. And so, just really, really kind of tough stuff to think about. But again, it just leads to these other possibilities. Other thing I have to mention, and I'm going to go over, but this is something very important that I want to talk about Travis Bickle's character. Is Travis Bickle racist? The film, I think, is very careful in terms of the monologues that Travis gives. Now, I don't like to, I don't want to give any swear words here, but as far as I can recall, none of his monologues includes that, or they include a lot of really bad epithets. But I don't think, I could be wrong, do they include any racial epithets? Again, I'm not sure about that. But what I am sure of is that there are moments in the film where we see shots of African American, let's say, men sitting at a diner, and it's a weird thing because we don't know if, for instance, there's a shot where Travis is walking into one of the diners and he meets Charlie T and Doughboy for the first time. He gives Charlie T a little bit of a side glance, although I don't think we necessarily have to interpret that as being like a racist thing against Charlie T. Charlie T is the one who always says, "Hey, killer," something like that, and they all call him Killer at this point, which is another thing that Travis does by osmosis, if you will, by other things in the film. He does other things by osmosis, the 44 Magnum, the 38. The fact that they call him Killer, it's almost like by osmosis, he does what it is they are calling him at this early point in the film, which is an interesting detail. But going back into this idea of the African American people as they're depicted, there are moments where Travis is seen looking off to the side, and we see shots, for instance, in that same sequence of like these guys. They look like, I don't know what they are, but they're just dressed up and they look menacing, or they're looking at Travis in what seems to be a menacing way. I'm not sure if they're really there or if that's part of Travis's imagination. Also, in a later scene, when Travis is walking out of a diner wanting to talk to Wizard, he walks out and we see Travis looking rather menacingly at one of the guys who are passing by, and it's an African American man who looks, and he's just looking also, and he's part of a crowd. Maybe it's trying to depict a group of just guys just walking, and then suddenly sees women fighting or something, having a little fight on the sidewalk there, and then Travis and Wizard have their conversation. But it's a weird cut, It's the same thing too with this idea of showing the kids throwing the trash at the taxi cab. These are African American kids as well. They're shown. Why include all this stuff, these details? Why? I mean, it doesn't make sense. Except that it is suggestive of, I think, the possibility, at least, that Travis is a racist. Now, this is a kind of an interesting thing, right? These racial. I'm glad I don't want to forget this, right? The racial epithets that are used is in fact, I don't think it's Travis necessarily, but it's Scorsese as the taxi cab customer, right? He says, do you know who lives there? He says, I know you don't know, but do you know who lives there? He's talking about the apartment that his wife is visiting, lives there, right? So, that is a very, that is a very terrible word to use, obviously. So I think we know something about the character that Scorsese is portraying in the film. I think we already know about him and his views. But what about Travis? I think if we can take, this is the sort of thing that is a little bit rough. If we take the Scorsese cab, the cab customer to be something that is like a source of external stimuli, then perhaps the racist tendencies of that customer were absorbed by Travis, perhaps, just as other details like the 44 Magnum were absorbed by Travis. I mean, we know that he, as a character, it operates in fundamental ways like this. But also, there are some inherent moments in the film that I think rather disturbingly show the possibility that there is at least some tendency towards this. Now, I think this is counterbalanced by the relationship that Travis seems to have with Charlie T, the other cabbie there. Now, there are some moments, granted, where Travis seems to be looking at Charlie T kind of like a sidelong glance, that sort of thing. And then we see Charlie say, "Hey, long killer, where's that 5 you owe me?" And Charlie says, "My man is loaded," that sort of thing. But in others, there does seem to be a relationship between Travis and Charlie T, which would, if that's the case, that would go against, we would think anyway, we would think go against the notion that Travis is a racist. So, for me, it is not clear. Although I think the film points towards indications that Travis, could be a racist. And I don't even think that his relationship with Charlie T, as positive as it might be taken to be, I don't think it necessarily means that it counteracts against any racist tendencies that Travis might have. That's a very interesting point too, because in the end, ultimately, though, what makes the conversation even more, I think, fascinating and perhaps potentially complicated is that, remember who Travis's victims ultimately are, right? They are these pimps and this mafia guy. So they aren't necessarily carrying out or actualizing any kind of hatred that Travis might, or it could be interpreted that he might have towards people of other races necessarily. I don't know what right? He doesn't go on a rampage against a certain, group of people necessarily. He goes on a rampage against these people in Iris's life. And so I think that makes the story of him, or him as a character, and his potential feelings towards people of other races, I think, well, let me put it this way, and let me return to the chat room, but let me put it this way, as saying, I don't think that while it necessarily is an automatic counter agent to any interpretations that Travis could be racist, I think it is still very interesting that he doesn't, if he is racist, he doesn't necessarily, he's not shown lashing out in those terms with his violence. He's not shown in that way, but he's shown lashing out with his violence against a seemingly different crowd of people within the confines of the film. And I think that's it leaves, therefore, that issue of him and his character still open for interpretation and, I think, a healthy debate. Although I do side with the people who think that he does have these racist tendencies towards certain groups of people. So anyway, that is that. I didn't want to forget that, because I think that's a very important point about his character. It makes his character much more complicated too. It makes it not necessarily a character that we can, at least I can, wholly 100% sympathize with, because I can't do that. But I think we're not meant to, and I think therefore the film, it becomes all the more of a complex and nuanced and complicated viewing experience, which I think is really quite great, because it throws into question the whole motivations behind these actions to begin with. I mean, I don't think we're meant to see this film as an adrenaline rush vigilante pick. On the contrary, it is not that at all. It is, if anything, it is a kind of a horrifying, quite disturbing examination into this particular character, and it examines this character in a way that I don't think we're meant to sympathize with him all the way. We're not meant to side with all of his choices all the way. I think we're meant to question him. We're meant to be be disgusted by him. We're also meant to be feel sorry for him. But also, there are some moments, vis-a-vis him and Iris and what he's trying to do with Iris, for example. There are some moments where I think we want to root for him and want to see him succeed. Although at that point, we don't quite know what his methods are. I know, of course, we want him to convince Iris to succeed, but at the same time, if we had known that he was going to do what he did, I think it would have made for a much more complex viewing experience, at least for the first time. So I think my point is that the Travis Bickle character is really one of the most complex characters in modern 20th century American cinema, definitely from the cinema of the 1970s, and so that is it's a credit to how complex and rich this film is, and also that this film is timeless and it still holds up even now. Okay, so let's see here. So I'm just going to, if I skip over your comments, I apologize, but I'm just going to go over here and look to what it is you have to say in the comment section. Let's see. Okay, just skipping out. Trey is here. Hello, Trey. Nice to see you. The shootout gets more stylized once it moves indoors. Yes, it does. It's quite a stylized thing. There's use of the filters, right, to lessen the impact of the blood, apparently, in order to avoid an X rating. I think that's the story. But there's the long shot that holds on Travis in Sport before Travis does what he does, and then it cuts to Travis going in, and then that terrible shot with the hand and all this, just like the way in which Travis uses the knife, and he uses the knife, and at the point of when he uses it to cut, the film cuts, it's edits, it's just, really quite surreal almost. And oh gosh, it's really such a frightening moment. So well done, so well constructed. Trey Tyson says Manila in the Clouds of Light is another lonely man on the street. Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about other films, but I do like the comparison between Taxi Driver and Manila in the Clouds of Light, which is also in the Criterion Collection. And I do recognize also the connections between those two films. So if you like Taxi Driver, then you might also be interested in the film Manila in the Clouds of Light. Let's see, Javid Malik, hello, it's nice to see you. Yes, is Joe Spinell in Taxi Driver? He's quite in a few movies. Yes, he was at the very beginning. He played the guy that was questioning Travis when he was interviewing for the job. But that's the only part of the film where he appears, as far as I understand it. So he's at the very beginning, but that's it. But it's very memorable, and he has a speaking role. Let's see, Trey says, I like the other Taxi Drivers too, even though the movie doesn't focus on them much. Yes, Doughboy and he got the little piece of the bathtub, Errol Flynn's bathtub or something like that. He's looking at the watermarks. I don't know, yeah. And what is this? You have change for a nickel? Let's see. I forgot to mention also, I'm going off topic here, but speaking of that interview at the beginning, you notice that there's a moment where the scene cuts for an overhead shot of the stuff on the desk as the Joe Spinell character hands him a piece of paper or something. There's a similar kind of shot that happens when Travis talks to Betsy for the first time, and he goes into the office and he says, he says to her, I think you're a lonely person, and I see all this stuff on your desk and it means nothing. And he goes like this with his hand over the stuff on her desk, the phones and papers and stuff, and there's a shot overhead of that stuff looking over onto the stuff on the desk. It's a rather abrupt shot. There's something similar that happens too when Travis buys like the Coke, the Royal Crown Cola, and the popcorn or something like that in the movie theater at the beginning with Diane Abbott, and he gives the money, and there's a shot overhead of that exchange. And then there's also, of course, the very famous shot at the end where there's the overhead shot of Travis and the results of his carnage after he has shot up the entire place there, and the camera slowly moves overhead. I love those overhead shots because they're almost like they're the ultimate form objectification of the situations or events in the film, and the way that they're focusing in on things and objects and people over in this overhead shot. It's almost a visual cinematic expression of Travis's phrase, right? There is no escape. I'm God's lonely man. It's the God's eye point of view of things shot from above down below. It's also a kind of thing of objectifying things or looking at the objects or things on the ground, as it were. Almost the fetishization, did I get that right? Fetishization of things and objects, which, if that's the case too, I think that it figures in so well with this film and how Travis transforms once he gets his guns, his firearms, right? It's almost, there's a moment where he first sees the 44 Magnum as it's on the bed there, and there's a shot of the thing, the camera goes across the barrel, the fetishization of things, but it creates it has a transformative element that makes the fetishization, at least in Travis's example, quite dangerous. And I should point out that scene where he gets the gun. Remember when he's trying out, it's the 38 Snubnose, I think, and he's seeing with his arm, and it's a point of view of his arm, he's pointing it out of the window, and he points it at like I think there are two women with umbrellas talking. Now that is scary. That is a scary moment. I know it's not loaded. I know the film doesn't that scene is not set up to suggest that he's going to actually shoot them, but that is a frightening moment. One of the most frightening moments. That we're talking about Travis as a hero or villain. I mean, that's a moment. That's as villainous as we can get, you know. But anyway, sorry about that. I tend to just go on these sort of sidelines. I really apologize. Jared says, the film offers so many ways of viewing the plot and characters, particularly Travis. Yes, I agree. I absolutely agree. Ricky Brown, hello Daisuke, big fan of yours and of Taxi Driver. Definitely comes in close second to Chinatown as my all-time favorite classic movie. Well, thank you, Ricky, for joining. I hope you're well. Ole says, there's a story that Scorsese and De Niro went to a Bruce Springsteen concert after a day of shooting, and during the concert he said the line, "Are you talking to me?" And then Jared continues, "You talking to me is one of the best lines, not just in film history, but one of the best improvised lines said on film. The story behind that line is also interesting. Travis calling himself God's lonely man may tell us quite a bit more about him than he himself could say. It's a very powerful line." JR62 is here. Hello. Brian McGuire's here. Hello. Hey, hey, Copper. So yes, if so, it's right. What does he say? It's an entrapment already, right? Right, something like that, right? So, but looks aren't everything, right? And I love the line where he says, where Travis says, you know, I'm hip. I love that Robert De Niro delivery. You know, I'm hip, and then he says, Harvey Keitel, you don't look hip, right? Yeah. And then Paul Emery says here, greetings, hello. And it's nice to see you, Paul. All right. And JR62 says, had to throw out my copy on Laser. There's too much rot on it. Oh, that's too bad. That's too bad. But laser rot is a thing. So, yes, Nazarene Prod said he definitely has problems. He being Travis definitely has problems with people who he doesn't understand. I think there's underlying racism there. Yes, I actually agree with you as well for the reasons that I tried to explain a few minutes ago. Yes, Jared Wignall says, early in the film at the porno theater, he tries to get the woman's name at the concession stand and she threatens to get the manager. Yes, that's right. And perhaps his PTSD has made him cold and disconnected to the world. Perhaps. Nazarene Prod continues, there's also self-hatred there, but he doesn't understand this clearly. And Tim says, wondering if Travis Bickle would be considered as an okay. Yes, incel character if it were released in this day and age. I don't want to get into that, but I know exactly what you're talking about, yes. Oleander Rainbow Glycerine says, I just saw this movie today. Needless to say, Travis Bickle is an anti-hero, but a sympathetic anti-hero. I like how you put that, Leander. That's a really great way of putting that. An anti-hero, but a sympathetic anti-hero. I see why people like this movie. I like the JR62. I like the way he pulls his gun and shuts. No talking or speeches. No talking or speeches. Although he does have a little bit of a speech when he... Matt S. Says the Criterion Laserdisc cover is fantastic. Yes, I agree. Let's see. Okay, just skipping over some comments here. Just Gary Yudman, hello. I think it's interesting that the only moment of overt racism displayed by a character happens in the isolated environment of the taxi, that the man can only say these things to a complete stranger. That is a very great way of describing it, and that is very interesting. A one-on-one situation that is isolated from the rest of the outside world to this complete stranger whom he knows, the Scorsese cameo character whom he knows that probably won't say this to anyone. It won't hurt him. He won't be reprimanded for saying this. He won't be penalized for saying this thing. You're right. But it is so jarring and so shocking when it does come out. That makes the symbol of the taxi all the more potent and powerful. You're absolutely right. Well done for pointing that out, Gary. I love how you mentioned that. Just skipping. Okay, Jam Moshango and the Randy Moles movie show. Hello. It's nice to see you, my friends. I hope you're well. And Paul Emery. I'm sorry. I'm skipping over some great comments here. Jared says, I don't think Travis, died at the end, though he was severely injured, and him being praised could be seen how the media would portray the story as Travis saving Iris from prostitution as heroic. Yes, I agree with you in my own personal take on the film. I don't think he died. I think it is a commentary on the social reaction to his actions. And just skipping over here, Paul Emery says, all the supporting roles, including Albert Brooks, were spot on. I love the Albert Brooks role. I think it's so great to have him as a great contrast to Travis Bickle, and what Betsy. I mean, I don't know if we don't know enough about Betsy's character to think maybe she had other boyfriends. I'm not sure. There are other men in her life, but as far as the film shows, the only men potential romantic interest to her would be Travis or Tom. So I think Tom, therefore, makes a great contrast to Travis and what he is, and therefore I think makes Travis's first approach to Betsy, I think, much more believable. I think had Tom not been there, I think Travis's first approach to Betsy might not necessarily have been that believable. But then that just is assuming that Betsy has a very limited life in terms of these are the only men in her life. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are many friends that she has outside of her work and taxis. But anyway, that's just pure speculation. All right. Let's see. MVP says the 1976 Democratic National Convention was held from July 12th to the 15th. That makes sense too in the timing, because the film, I understand, takes place, I think, from May to July, I think. And so July, and we understand that I think the events of the film at the end occurred prior to Palantine getting the nomination, right? Because we understand that afterwards, if we assume that it wasn't a fantasy, then Travis did what he did. He got shot and he fell into a coma, and when he was revived, when he was in a coma, he was unable to meet the parents, Bert and Ivy Steensma, the parents of Iris, who visited from Pittsburgh, I think. And so when he came out of his coma and he's driving a taxi, then he sees Betsy for the last time. He says, I heard Palantine got the nomination. So so it makes sense, therefore, if the Democratic National Convention was in July, then the events of the film were actually in May to early July, I think. We know that from the dates, some of the dates that he mentions during his diary entries. So that makes sense. And MVP says, another interesting bit of timing. July 2nd, 1976 was when the Supreme Court of the United States reaffirmed the death penalty nationally, although New York didn't have a death penalty statute until 1995. Isaac Dunn, hello, it's nice to see you. let's see. MVP says, "I'm just saying the letter and news clippings are quite possibly a fantasy he concocts in the final moments of the." Yes, that's also very possible. I understand. Yeah, that approach as well. That's very possible. And let's see. Jared says Travis appears that he's racist, yet he never calls black people a racial slur. You can tell he's not too fond of black people, yet he's fairly hospitable to Charlie T. Maybe because he's a taxi driver. Yes, yes. Mike Eli says, "I feel like Scorsese never shied away from the subject of racism that exists in New York. It seems to be somewhat present in most of his work." Yes, I agree. I absolutely agree. Gary says, "From what I understand, in the original screenplay, the character Sport and other pimps who die in the shootout were supposed to be black, but Scorsese and Paul Schrader changed it at the last second." That's an interesting detail, yes. Jared Wignall says, "And also that woman at the porno theater was black, but then again, she was also a woman. So maybe that says something regarding the racist conversation about Travis." Yes, that's a good point. I forgot to mention that, but that's a very good point, Jared. That really great point. Theodore, hey people. Gary says, "Are you a narc? Are you a narc? Do I look like a narc?" Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. I love that moment between him and Jodie Foster. That's a great scene. That's such a great scene. Which is, do you ever look at your own eyeballs in the mirror? That's what she says. That's such a great moment. Yeah. And he's talking about going to one of them communes in Vermont. All right. So, okay, now time to go because it's what 8:25 here, so I have to get going soon. So, anyway, my friends, that is my discussion with you on Taxi Driver, and I just want to suggest at the very end here that it's a much more. I think it's one of the most complicated films out there. It is very nuanced, very heavy in terms of its vacillation between or among different poles or different tones, which therefore makes it not an easy watch by any stretch. But I think it is a very rewarding watch, and it's one that I think just by seeing the comments that all of you have made today is one that I know you have thought about very much, and you have taken a lot of time and care to think about. And so I thank you very much from the bottom of my heart, as always, my friends, for your time and your energy and commitment. As always, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you about this really fascinating film. Okay, so that's it for now. I want to say I haven't made any plans for any next scheduled live stream film clubs, and the only reason is because my dinner schedule is a little bit up in the air now, so I'm not quite sure what I can do. Once I decide something, or once things are much clearer with my schedule, I will let you know as soon as possible, my dear friends. So in the meantime, I will, I think, I think the next thing I'm supposed to be putting up is the Criterion poll. Is going to be closed soon. So as soon as that's closed, I will make some videos announcing what the poll results are. But if you haven't voted in the poll, you still have time. So check out that video and let me know what your favorites are. Okay, so with that, my friends, thank you very much. And yes, so thank you very much for your time. And until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies, my dear friends. Thank you and cheers. All right, we're done. So thank you. All right, so we are out of here. So thank you very much again, and your discussions were really great. I will be in touch later, and yeah, thank you once again. It's been fun. I've learned so much from you as always, and your comments were really great. So, my friends, be well. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are. And I will talk to all of you hopefully very, very soon. All right, take good care of yourselves, and I will see you again.